The darkest hours, where true crime meets horror. There's an unsettling truth about real crime stories that fiction can never quite capture. While horror movies end when the credits roll, these cases continue to echo through time, leaving permanent scars on our collective psyche. Each victim's story, each killer's descent into darkness, serves as a reminder that sometimes reality is far more terrifying than anything we could imagine. Join me as I explore 8 of the most chilling cases that blur the line between crime and horror. 1. The Hinterkaifeck Farm Murders, The Watcher in the Attic. Deep in the Bavarian countryside, 1922, the Gruber family lived on an isolated farm called Hinterkaifeck. The farm sat alone among the fields, a 2-hour walk from the nearest neighbor. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, lived there with his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, her 2 children, Joseph and Kazilia, and their new maid, Maria Baumgartner. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the brutal murder of 6 people. It's the methodical stalking that preceded it. 6 months before the murders, the previous maid quit abruptly. She claimed the farm was haunted, speaking of mysterious footsteps in the attic and whispers in empty rooms. Andreas dismissed her fears as superstition. Then, in the depths of winter, he began noticing things himself. Footprints appeared in the fresh snow leading from the dark forest edge to their home, but none leading back. Keys disappeared from their usual places, only to reappear days later in different locations. Newspapers materialized in the house that no one remembered buying. Strange sounds echoed from the attic late at night. Most disturbing of all were the scratch marks they found around the lock of the tool shed. Someone had tried to break in, not to steal tools, but to borrow them and return them. The implications were terrifying. The intruder wasn't interested in theft. They wanted access to the family's daily life. On the night of March 31, 1922, the unknown presence finally emerged from the shadows. The family was lured to the barn one by one, where each was killed with a mattock, a tool similar to a pickaxe. The killer began with Andreas, then Kazilia, Victoria, and 7-year-old Joseph. Inside the house, the killer found Maria Baumgartner, who had only arrived at the farm hours earlier for her first day of work. The last to die was little Kazilia. In a detail that haunts investigators to this day, evidence suggested she survived her initial wounds and lived for several hours after the attack. Investigators found clumps of her hair scattered around her body. She had torn it out herself in terror as she lay dying next to her murdered family. But the horror didn't end with the murders. For 4 days after the killings, neighbors noticed smoke rising from the chimney. The cattle were fed and milked. Meals were cooked in the kitchen. Someone was living in the house with the corpses, sleeping in the beds of those they had murdered, carrying out a grotesque parody of domestic life. When the bodies were finally discovered, the killer had vanished. The investigation revealed disturbing possibilities: incest, family secrets, and evidence that Victoria's young son Joseph may have been fathered by her own father, Andreas. But no suspect was ever charged. The case has become legendary in Germany, spawning countless theories. Some believe it was a vengeful former servant. Others point to a neighbor who supposedly harbored an obsession with Victoria. The most disturbing theory suggests that one of the victims was the killer, living with the family while methodically planning their deaths. To this day, the farm's location remains marked on maps, though the buildings were demolished years ago. Locals say nothing grows on the land where the farm once stood, as if the earth itself remembers the horror that took place there. 2. The Chicago Ripper Crew, Horror on the Highways. In the early 1980s, Chicago's bustling suburbs became hunting grounds for a group that seemed to emerge straight from a horror movie. The Ripper Crew, led by Robin Gecht, a former employee of notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy, committed a series of ritualistic murders that still defy comprehension and rational explanation. The crew consisted of 4 men: Robin Gecht, Edward Spritzer, and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokoralius. What makes their case particularly chilling is how they merged everyday suburban life with unspeakable sadism. These weren't social outcasts or obvious monsters. They were employed, married men who would commit acts of inconceivable brutality and then return home to their families for dinner. Their hunting method was brazen in its simplicity. Cruising the streets in a red van, they would look for lone women, offering help or directions. Sometimes they would pose as police officers. In broad daylight, on busy streets, they proved that monsters don't wait for darkness to strike. At least 18 women fell victim to their tactics, though the true number may be higher. The ritual nature of their killings set them apart from other criminal groups. In Geck's attic, they had constructed a makeshift chapel dedicated to Satan. The room was decorated with occult symbols and contained an altar made from a wooden block. After abducting their victims, they would bring them to this chapel for torture sessions that could last for days. Each murder followed a specific ritual. The victims would be subjected to unspeakable torture while the crew chanted prayers to Satan. They believed each killing would imbue them with supernatural powers. Most disturbing was their practice of removing one breast from each victim with a wire garrote, which would then be eaten during their satanic ceremonies. Geck allegedly masturbated into a human skull during these rituals, believing this would give him control over demons. The crew's activities might have continued indefinitely if not for a survivor who managed to escape and provide police with details about her captors. When police finally caught up with the group, they discovered notebooks containing detailed records of their crimes, including dates, victims' names, and descriptions of their rituals. During interrogation, Edward Spritzer provided horrifying details about their activities. He described how Geck had convinced them that each murder would add to their supernatural powers. The more pain they inflicted, the more power they would receive. This belief system had transformed ordinary men into monsters capable of acts that shocked even hardened investigators. The aftermath of the case revealed how thoroughly evil can hide behind normal facades. Geck's neighbors described him as a friendly handyman who often helped with household repairs. Spritzer was considered a reliable employee at his job. The Kokoralius brothers were active in their church. Yet together, they created a storm of horror that swept through Chicago's suburbs for years. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that Geck had worked for John Wayne Gacy's construction company years earlier. This connection raised disturbing questions about the nature of evil. Could the influence of one monster create others? Did Gacy somehow inspire Geck's sadistic tendencies? Today, Robin Geck remains in prison, still maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Edward Spritzer and Andrew Kokoralius received death sentences, though only Kokoralius was executed. Thomas Kokoralius was released in 2019 after serving half of his 70-year sentence, proving that sometimes monsters do get second chances. 3. The Toy Box Killer, David Parker Ray's House of Horrors. In the vast New Mexico desert, amid endless horizons and empty highways, David Parker Ray constructed a vision of hell on earth. What appeared to be an ordinary silver trailer from the outside was actually a $100,000 homemade torture chamber that he called his toy box. This mobile chamber of horrors contained surgical tools, medical equipment, and sophisticated torture devices he designed himself during his work as a mechanical engineer. What makes this case particularly disturbing is Ray's clinical, almost scientific approach to torture and psychological manipulation. He didn't just want to inflict pain, he wanted to completely break his victims' minds. To this end, he recorded a chilling audio tape to play for his victims when they regained consciousness after being drugged and kidnapped. The transcript of this tape runs to 28 pages and remains one of the most disturbing documents in criminal history. In a calm, matter-of-fact voice, Ray would explain to his terrified victims exactly what would happen to them. He described how they had been kidnapped, what tools he would use on them, and how their ongoing torture would transform them into sex slaves. The tape included details about previous victims who had disappeared forever when they failed to follow his instructions. Ray didn't work alone. His girlfriend Cindy Hendy and daughter Jessie Ray were active participants in his crimes. This family dynamic adds another layer of horror to the case. How does a father convince his own daughter to participate in torture and murder? What kind of conversations happened around their dinner table? The toy box itself was a masterpiece of sadistic engineering. It contained a gynecological chair modified with restraints, a variety of sexual torture devices, and an elaborate electrical system designed to deliver shocks to various parts of the body. The walls were covered with implements of torture and detailed anatomical charts showing various nerve clusters and pain points. Ray had even installed a mirror on the ceiling so victims could watch their own torture. Perhaps most horrifying was Ray's meticulous documentation of his crimes. He kept detailed logs, photographs, and videos of his victims' suffering. He approached torture like a science experiment, noting which techniques were most effective at breaking his victims' will. He even wrote an instruction manual for other potential torturers, describing his methods in clinical detail. The full scope of Ray's crimes may never be known, While he claimed to have kidnapped and killed 40 women over a period of 40 years, investigators were only able to verify a handful of cases. Many of his victims were sex workers or transients, people less likely to be reported missing. Others were so traumatized by their experiences that they repressed the memories or were too afraid to come forward. Ray was finally caught in 1999 when one of his victims, Cynthia Vigil, managed to escape after 3 days of torture. She ran naked through the streets of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, with a slave collar around her neck, finally finding refuge in a mobile home park. Her testimony led police to Ray's property, where they discovered his house of horrors. During the investigation, several other survivors came forward with similar stories of abduction and torture. One victim, Kelly Garrett, had been held captive for 2 months. When she finally escaped and reported her ordeal to police, they didn't believe her story was real. Ray's crimes seemed too horrible to be true. Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, but died of a heart attack in 2002, just 1 year into his sentence. His death left many questions unanswered. How many victims remained undiscovered? Where were the bodies buried? The vast New Mexico desert holds many secrets, and some may never come to light. The toy box itself was eventually destroyed by authorities, but its legacy lives on in the nightmares of its survivors and in the annals of true crime history as one of the most sophisticated torture chambers ever discovered. 4. H. Holmes and the Murder Castle, America's first serial killer hotel. In 1893, as Chicago prepared for the world's Columbian Exposition, Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes, was putting the finishing touches on his masterpiece of murder, a 3-story building that would later become known as the Murder Castle. This wasn't just a location for killing, it was an elaborate machine designed for the sole purpose of taking human life in the most efficient way possible. What makes this case particularly fascinating is Holmes's architectural approach to murder. The building's design was a physical manifestation of its creator's twisted mind. Standing at 601 to 603 West 63rd Street, the structure appeared from the outside to be an ordinary commercial building with shops on the ground floor and hotel rooms above. But its true purpose was far more sinister. Holmes used an ingenious strategy during construction to ensure no single person understood the building's true nature. He hired and fired different contractors for different portions of the work, claiming that each previous contractor had done unsatisfactory work. This meant no one person ever saw the complete plans or understood how all the pieces fit together. The interior of the Murder Castle was a maze of horrors. Some rooms were sealed completely, accessible only through trapdoors in the ceiling. Others were lined with asbestos, making them soundproof and fireproof, perfect for containing screams and preventing escape. Gas lines ran into many of the rooms, allowing Holmes to fill them with gas at will, either rendering his victims unconscious or killing them outright. The second floor contained torture chambers equipped with medieval devices. One room was stretched to abnormal proportions, so large that Holmes called it the secret hanging chamber. Another room was lined with blowtorches that could be activated from the outside, literally roasting anyone trapped inside. Perhaps most disturbing were the body chutes, special shafts that ran from the upper floors directly to the basement. Here, Holmes had installed a dissection table, various acids vats, and a crematorium. He would strip the flesh from his victims' bones, articulate the skeletons, and sell them to medical schools. Nothing went to waste in Holmes's efficient operation. The timing of his operation was crucial to its success. The 1893 World's Fair brought thousands of visitors to Chicago, many of them young women traveling alone for the first time. Holmes would offer them jobs in his pharmacy or rooms in his hotel. Many were never seen again. The constant flow of travelers meant that disappearances often went unnoticed or were attributed to the general chaos of the fair. Holmes didn't just kill for pleasure, he turned murder into a business. He took out life insurance policies on many of his victims, using various aliases and forged documents. He would then file claims on these policies after disposing of the bodies. He also profited from selling his victims' skeletons and organs to medical schools, which were desperate for anatomical specimens at the time. His methods of killing were as varied as they were cruel. Some victims were gassed in their rooms. Others were strangled or beaten to death. Many were locked in airtight vaults and left to suffocate while Holmes watched through special peepholes he had installed. He would sometimes dissect victims while they were still alive, turning murder into a form of medical experimentation. The exact number of his victims remains unknown. Holmes himself claimed 27 murders, but estimates range as high as 200. The difficulty in determining an accurate count stems from several factors: the transient nature of his victims, the thoroughness of his disposal methods, and the chaos of Chicago during the World's Fair. Holmes's downfall came not from murder, but from insurance fraud. After the fair ended, he left Chicago and attempted various schemes across the country. He was finally arrested in Boston for horse theft, which led investigators to uncover his larger criminal enterprise. During his trial, Holmes remained remarkably composed. He gave detailed confessions that later proved to be mostly lies, playing mind games with investigators until the end. He was hanged on May 7, 1896, in Philadelphia. According to witnesses, his neck didn't snap immediately, and he writhed for more than 15 minutes before finally dying. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Holmes case is how it demonstrates that serial killers don't emerge fully formed, they evolve. Before building his murder castle, Holmes had committed smaller crimes: fraud, theft, and possibly a few experimental murders. The castle represents the culmination of his evolution as a killer, showing how a fraudster became one of America's most prolific murderers. 5. The Dnepropetrovsk Maniacs, When Kids Kill. In the summer of 2007, the Ukrainian city of Dnepropetrovsk became a hunting ground for what media would later call the Academy Killers. 3 teenagers, Viktor Sayenko, Igor Saprunyuk, and Alexander Hanja, embarked on a killing spree that would shake not just their city, but the entire world's understanding of youthful violence. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but the complete absence of traditional motive and their methodical documentation of each murder. These weren't troubled youth from broken homes or victims of abuse, a narrative we often use to explain away such violence. All 3 came from wealthy, respected families. Viktor and Igor were excellent students at a prestigious preparatory school, planning to study business administration. Alexander was known for his intelligence and computer skills. They played sports, had girlfriends, and were considered popular among their peers. Their descent into violence began with animal torture, a common precursor to human violence. But unlike most killers who keep their early experiments secret, they filmed everything. They would capture stray dogs, torture them with screwdrivers and hammers, and record their deaths. These videos were stored on their computers alongside homework assignments and family photos. Their first human victim was 33-year-old Ekaterina Ilchenko, walking home from a music class on July 25, 2007. Igor approached her asking for directions while Viktor filmed with his cell phone. Without warning, Igor swung a hammer, striking her in the side of the head. The teens later described feeling an overwhelming euphoria during the kill. They would chase this feeling for the next 3 weeks. What followed was a spree of incredible violence, 21 murders in just 21 days. Their weapon of choice was a hammer, though they occasionally used screwdrivers or steel construction bars. They attacked indiscriminately, men, women, elderly, teens. A pregnant woman. A child walking with his mother. Their only criteria seemed to be opportunity and vulnerability. Most disturbing was their attitude during the attacks. The cell phone videos, later discovered by police, show them laughing and joking during murders. In one particularly horrific recording, they can be heard discussing the quality of the lighting while their victim bleeds out. They would often return to bodies hours later to film more footage, treating their crimes like some twisted film project. The videos themselves reveal the true horror of their spree. One recording, known as 3 Guys 1 Hammer, leaked online and became infamous in dark web circles. It shows the murder of 48-year-old Sergei Yatsenko, who they found by the side of the road with a flat tire. The teenagers offered to help, then attacked him with hammers and a screwdriver. They filmed his suffering for over 4 minutes, stopping occasionally to comment on his resilience or laugh at his attempts to protect himself. The killers developed their own system of rules and rituals. They would only kill on weekdays, considering weekends their time to rest and socialize. They kept trophies, items of little value taken from victims, organized in Igor's garage. They created a point system for different types of kills, awarding extra points for victims who lived longer or fought back more vigorously. Their capture came through a combination of survivor testimony and their own hubris. After attacking but failing to kill 14-year-old Vadim Lyakov, they left behind crucial evidence. Moreover, they had been attempting to sell their murder videos to a foreign website, leaving a digital trail. When police raided their homes, they found not just evidence of their crimes, but homework assignments mixed with murder plans, family photos alongside death photos. During interrogation, their behavior was perhaps most chilling of all. They showed no remorse, discussing their crimes with the same casual attitude one might use to describe a sporting event. When asked why they killed, Igor Sapruniuk responded simply, "To see what it felt like." Viktor Sayenko added that they wanted to have some experiences to talk about later in life. The trial revealed the full scope of their activities, including several murders previously attributed to accidents or other causes. The evidence was overwhelming: videos, photographs, physical evidence, and survivor testimony. Yet throughout the proceedings, the killers maintained an air of bored indifference, occasionally smirking at particularly graphic testimony. Both Sayenko and Sapruniuk were sentenced to life imprisonment. Hanja, who had participated in the robberies but not the murders, received a 9-year sentence. The case left Ukrainian society struggling with difficult questions. How could children from good families become such monsters? What role did their privileged background play in their development? Most disturbing of all, how many other seemingly normal teenagers might be capable of similar acts? 6. Robert Hansen, the human hunter. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, Robert Hansen found the perfect hunting ground for his twisted desires. Between 1971 and 1983, he would kidnap women, fly them into the remote Alaskan wilderness in his private plane, and hunt them like game. What makes this case particularly horrifying isn't just the murders themselves, but the methodical planning and prolonged torture of his victims. Hansen's background seems almost deliberately designed to create the perfect predator. He was an accomplished hunter and pilot, skills that would later serve his dark purposes. He owned a successful bakery in Anchorage, providing him with both a respectable facade and the means to fund his hunts. He was married with children, active in his Lutheran church, and known as a quiet, hard-working member of the community. But behind this careful masking of normalcy lay a seething resentment toward women, born from years of teenage rejection due to his severe acne and stutter. His first documented crimes were arsons, burning down a school bus garage in his hometown. This early expression of rage would later evolve into something far more sinister. His method of hunting humans was terrifyingly well planned. He would target sex workers and exotic dancers, correctly assuming their disappearances would attract less attention. After kidnapping them, he would rape and torture them in his basement, then offer them a chance at freedom that was nothing more than another form of torture. Hansen would fly his victims out to remote locations in his Piper Super Cub, a small bush plane perfect for landing on rough terrain. He would strip them naked, give them a head start, and then hunt them with his hunting rifle. Some victims would run for hours through the brutal Alaskan wilderness before he finally caught up with them. The horror of these hunts is almost impossible to comprehend. Victims were not just running for their lives, they were running naked through mosquito-infested forests, across freezing streams, through thick brush that tore at their skin, all while knowing that every step was merely prolonging the inevitable. Hansen later admitted he enjoyed watching them run, comparing it to hunting wild game. His trophy room was a study in contradictions. Mounted heads of legal game animals shared space with jewelry taken from his human victims. He kept detailed maps marking the locations where he buried bodies, treating his murders with the same methodical attention he gave to his legitimate hunting expeditions. The investigation that finally caught him revealed the frightening extent of his activities. Jewelry from victims was found carefully sorted and stored. Maps were discovered with small X marks noting burial locations. Most disturbing were his hunting journals, where he recorded details of his human hunts alongside entries about moose and bear hunting trips. When finally caught, Hansen tried to maintain his respectable facade, initially denying everything. But faced with mounting evidence, including testimony from victims who had escaped, he eventually confessed to 17 murders, though investigators believe the true number could be higher. Perhaps most chilling were the details that emerged about his family life. His wife and children had no idea about his activities. He would commit his crimes while supposedly on hunting trips or working late at the bakery. He would torture and kill women in his basement while his family slept upstairs, then serve fresh bread to customers the next morning. The wilderness itself became an accomplice to his crimes. Alaska's vast expanses and sparse population meant bodies could remain hidden for years. Some of his victims have never been found, their remains scattered by bears and wolves across the tundra. Hansen's case represents a perfect storm of factors that allowed him to kill for years without detection: a respectable social position, a plausible cover for his activities, careful victim selection, and a landscape that helped him hide his crimes. He died in prison in 2014, taking many secrets to his grave. 7. The Real Annabelle, the Donnelly Case. While not a murder case, the events that inspired the Annabelle films represent one of the most well-documented cases of alleged supernatural violence in modern history. In 1970, nursing students Donna and Angie received what seemed to be an ordinary Raggedy Ann doll that would become the center of increasingly disturbing phenomena. What makes this case unique is not just the supernatural elements, but the extensive documentation by Ed and Lorraine Warren, prominent paranormal investigators whose careers would later inspire the Conjuring franchise. The case file they compiled reveals a progression of events that challenged rational explanation. The doll's activity began innocently enough. The students would return home to find it in different positions or locations from where they'd left it. Notes began appearing around their apartment, small pieces of paper with messages like "Help me" or "Help Lou" written in a child's handwriting. The students didn't have paper like this in their apartment, and the handwriting matched no one they knew. Things escalated when they began finding drops of what appeared to be blood on the doll. A friend named Lou, who had expressed skepticism about the doll's supposed supernatural nature, woke one night to find himself paralyzed, watching helplessly as the doll appeared to climb up his leg and begin strangling him. He would later discover inexplicable claw-like scratches on his chest. The Warrens' investigation revealed something more sinister than the simple haunting the students had assumed. According to their findings, the doll wasn't possessed by a child's spirit as initially believed, but by something demonic that was using the doll as a conduit. The entity had been slowly building up energy, feeding off the fear and attention it received, working toward a larger goal. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how it subverts our expectations about haunted objects. This wasn't a creepy porcelain doll or an ancient cursed artifact. It was a simple Raggedy Ann doll, the kind found in countless children's rooms across America. Its very ordinariness made it more terrifying. The case files detail increasingly violent phenomena: objects hurled across rooms, mysterious fires starting and extinguishing themselves, and physical attacks on visitors who showed disrespect to the doll. In one incident, a priest who had come to bless the apartment dismissed the case as nonsense, only to suffer a near-fatal car accident on his way home. The Warrens eventually took possession of the doll, but its activity didn't cease. During the drive to their occult museum, their car's brakes failed multiple times. Ed Warren reported seeing the doll levitate and move inside its carrying case. They finally contained it in a specially blessed case in their occult museum, where it remains today. Visitors to the museum have reported disturbing experiences around the doll's case. Some claim to see it change position or expression. Others report feeling physically ill or experiencing inexplicable accidents after mocking the doll. A motorcyclist who banged on the case, challenging the doll to do its worst, died in a crash hours later. What makes the Annabelle case particularly significant in the annals of paranormal investigation is the quality of documentation. Unlike many supernatural claims, this case has multiple witnesses, contemporary documentation, and physical evidence in the form of photographs, recordings, and written statements. 8. The Axeman of New Orleans, the Jazz Killer. In 1918 to 1919, New Orleans found itself terrorized by a killer who transformed murder into a macabre art form. The Axeman, as he came to be known, didn't just kill. He orchestrated a campaign of terror that played upon the city's deep-seated fears and its rich musical culture. What makes this case particularly fascinating is how the killer wove himself into the fabric of New Orleans' unique cultural tapestry. He didn't just murder, he created a theatrical persona that played upon the city's love of jazz and its history of voodoo and supernatural beliefs. His method of entry became his signature. He would chisel out panels of doors or windows, a time-consuming process that showed either supreme confidence or a complete disconnect from normal human fear responses. Once inside, he would use the household's own axe, often found in the victim's yard, to commit his murders. This detail added an extra layer of horror. The murder weapon had been sitting outside the victims' homes all along, waiting to be used against them. The crime scenes themselves were choreographed like grotesque theater productions. The axe would often be left in theatrical positions, sometimes balanced carefully against walls or arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance. Victims were generally killed as they slept, their heads crushed with savage blows, though some showed signs of having awakened during the attack. But it was his communication with the public that truly set him apart. On March 13, 1919, a letter appeared in the newspapers claiming to be from the Axeman. It read in part, "I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe." The city's response to this threat was unprecedented. On the night in question, New Orleans erupted in jazz. Every home, every bar, every possible venue had jazz music playing. People who couldn't play instruments played records. Those who couldn't afford records beat pots and pans rhythmically. The entire city became one massive jazz concert, dancing in desperate terror to avoid the Axeman's blade. No one was killed that night, but the Axeman's reign of terror continued. His victims included Italian grocers Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine, Louis Bessumer and his mistress Harriet Lowe, Mary Schneider, Joseph Romano, Charles Cortimiglia and his wife Rosie. Their 2-year-old daughter Mary survived but was severely wounded. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns. Many victims were Italian immigrants who owned small grocery stores. This led to theories about organized crime connections or anti-Italian sentiment. However, later victims didn't fit this pattern, suggesting the killer might have changed his criteria or never had specific targeting preferences at all. Some investigators believed the Axeman had supernatural abilities. Witnesses reported seeing a dark figure vanish into thin air or pass through solid walls. Others claimed he could change his shape at will. These reports played into New Orleans' rich tradition of voodoo and supernatural beliefs, adding another layer of terror to his reign. The Axeman was never caught. His last confirmed attack was in October 1919, though similar murders continued to occur sporadically through the 1920s. Theories about his identity ranged from organized crime hitman to supernatural entity to jealous lover seeking revenge. The case has become part of New Orleans folklore, a dark chapter in the city's rich history of music, murder, and mystery. The Axeman demonstrated how a killer could become more than just a murderer. He could become a dark cultural icon, manipulating an entire city's fears and beliefs to create his own legendary status. The horror within. These 8 cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. They remind us that real horror doesn't wear a mask or lurk in shadows. It lives next door, shops at our stores, and sometimes even wears a badge or collar. What makes these stories truly terrifying isn't just the gruesome details or the body counts. It's their implications about human nature. They force us to question everything we think we know about evil, sanity, and the thin line between ordinary citizen and monster. Perhaps that's why we're so fascinated by true crime horror. Not for the grotesque details or shocking revelations, but because each case holds up a dark mirror to society and asks, how well do we really know ourselves? What do you think? Which of these cases disturbs you the most? Share your thoughts below. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened.